On September 16th, protests broke out in Tehran and quickly spread over the death of a 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Eyewitnesses saw her beaten to death by the morality police. This is a heavy topic, but it's a really important topic. What can you explain what happened?
The protests are now in their sixth week. The death of that young woman occurred, who was visiting Tehran as a tourist, sparked something very deep that particularly concerned the younger generations. That is what you would call the equivalent of the Z generation in this country.
Yes.
They call themselves Dahe Hashtadi in Persian because Iran follows the solar calendar of its own. It's an ancient solar calendar. And the time that they were born, they were in the 1380s. That's what they call themselves, Hashtadi. 80s, Hashtad for the 80s. And the circumstances that surrounds the unfortunate death of this young, beautiful Kurdish woman is really tragic. She was arrested by what is referred to as the morality police, morality patrol, called Gasht Ershad, guidance police, that is. Presumably there were two women fully clad, that is officers serving on that force, and two men. And nobody exactly knows what had happened. She had been beaten up, and apparently there was no sign of any wrongdoing on her side. She was fully covered. It seems that there was some altercation in the process, and the outcome was that she was unconscious, not necessarily when she was arrested, but in the course of the detention, when they take them to a center, presumably to re-educate them.
Yeah.
And she apparently collapsed, and maybe my sense is that she must have had some kind of a problem because of the skull being broken or something had happened. And she died in the hospital the next day. And that, through the social media, was widely spread throughout Iran. And almost the next day, surprisingly, you could see this outburst of sympathy for her. People are in the streets weeping because she was seen as such an innocent young woman, 22 years old. And the family, the mother and the father, also mourning for her. And being a Kurd visiting Tehran, this all added up to really turn her into some kind of a martyr of this cause. And that's what it is. And her picture, graphics that were artistically produced based on her portrait has now dominates basically as the symbol of this protest movement. And the protest movement goes on. Everybody was thinking, or at least the authorities were thinking, that it's going to die out in a matter of a few days. But it became more intense, first in the streets of Tehran by young women, mostly probably between, I would say, 17, 18 teenagers to 22, 23, or thereabout, and then to university campuses all around the country, and then even to high schools. And that also made it a very remarkable protest movement because, first of all, it involves the youth and not necessarily the older generations. You see them around, but not as many. Also, you see men and women together, young girls and boys, and they are adamant, they are desperate in the sense of the tone of their protest, and they are extremely courageous because they stand against the security forces that were immediately were sent off to the streets. So, and in full gear. that is.
So, what are the currents of pain, emotion? Um, what is this turmoil that rose to the surface that resulted in these big protests? What are the different feelings, ideas that came to the surface here that resulted in such quick scaling of this protest?
Well, if you listen to the main slogan, which is the message of this movement, it's called Women, Life, Freedom, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, which is a translation of actually the Kurdish equivalent, which is close to Persian being a Indo-European language. And it's apparently initiated first in the Syrian Kurdistan, where they were fighting against the Islamic Daesh forces because they were attacking the Yazidis there and the women being enslaved. But the message, as it moved, historians are interested in this kind of trends. So it has moved to Kurdistan, and from Kurdistan now being the message of this movement, reflects pretty much, sums up what this movement is all about. Women in the forefront, because of all the, one might say, discriminations, the treatment, the humiliation that this younger generation feels, well, not only the younger generations, but most of the Iranian secular middle classes since 1979, basically, for the past 43 years. And they would think that these all basically symbolized or represented by the wearing, the mandatory wearing of the hijab, which is at the core of this protest. You see the young women, if you look at many of these clips that comes through in the past 6 weeks, women in streets take off their mandatory scarves, which is a young shawl or some kind of a head covering, that's all. And they throw it into the bonfire in the middle of the street and they dance around it and slogans. So there is a sense of complete rejection of what this regime for 43 years have been imposing on women. It's not, as it's sometimes been portrayed, a movement against hijab through and through. But it basically says, there has to be a choice for those who want to wear hijab and those who want to remain without hijab.
Yeah, the hijab is a symbol of something much deeper.
Much deeper. And actually, before we get into that, it's interesting to note that in many of these demonstrations you see in the university campuses or in the streets, you see women with hijab, young women with hijab, are next to those have to remove their hijab and they're together basically protesting. That's the most interesting feature of these demonstrations. And then men and women together against the segregation that the regime has imposed upon them for all these years. Now, in terms of what it represents, as I pointed out, one is the question of the whole series of, one might say, civil and legal discriminations against women. You are considered as a kind of a second-class citizen. You depend on your men. There's a kind of a patriarchy that has been institutionalized in the Islamic Republic in a very profound fashion. And that means that probably in matters of divorce, marriage and divorce, in matters of custody of your children, in matter of inheritance, in matter of freedom of movement, you depend on your husband, your father, your brother, a male member of your family, your child even, your son, could be the case. And because of that, obviously, a younger generation who is so well informed through social media knows about the world as much as an American does, American kid does, and probably sometimes more. They're very, very curious it's from what I hear, or sometimes that I met a few of them outside Iran, you'll see that how this new generation is completely different from what the Islamic Republic wanted to create in its social engineering. It's basically the failure of 43 years of the Islamic Republic's act of imposition of a certain so-called Islamic values on women. Then it's a matter of education. You would see that there is segregation in the schools. One of the issues that right now, is at the heart of these demonstrations is that self-services in many of the campuses of Iranian universities are segregated, male and female, to different rooms, to different halls. Now they're breaking through the walls virtually everywhere and sit together in order to basically resist the authorities who wants to impose segregation. In matters of appearance in the public, of course, it may seem to us as kind of trivial and secondary, but appearance is important. Clothing is important. How you would imagine yourself is important. They don't want to be seen in the way that the authorities would like to impose upon them, as this kind of an idea of a chaste Islamic woman who is fully covered and is fully protected. The idea of a male member of the family protects the female. That is what you would see at the heart of this rebellion. And of course, that goes with everything else. The second part of this message, the idea of life, basically means, if you like to use the American equivalent of this, the pursuit of the happiness. That's what they want. They want fun. They want music. They want dancing. They want to be free in the street. They want to have boyfriends and live freely, and don't be constantly looked by the big brother to tell them what to do and not to do, or not to do. So that is that they share virtually with the entire Iranian society as a whole. Although the older generations, that's a big puzzle. What you would see that the older generation don't, so far at least, don't take part as extensively as one might imagine. And this is a variety of reasons. Perhaps we can get to that later on, if you like. But as far as this younger generation, they don't care. They don't listen even as much to their parents as the older generations did. So, or one might say, even the nature of the relationship between the parents and the youth has changed. It's not the concept of, again, a patriarchy, that a father or even a mother would tell the daughter or son what to do. Because basically they have to negotiate.
It's fundamentally a rejection of the power of authority. Parents, government.
Yes.
It's that every person can decide their own fate, and there's no lessening of value of the wisdom of old age and old institutions.
Precisely, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And they are surprisingly aware that where they are as a generation. So it's a sense of a pride, as we are different from the older generation.
Yeah.
From your parents who compromised and lived with the restrictions that the Islamic regime put on you. Your their grandparents was the generation that actually involved in the revolution of 79. The parents, which were the middle generation, and these are the third generation after the revolution of 1979. And therefore they differentiate themselves in terms of their identity from the older generation. So that's the life part of it. And one can go more and more. They want to access, and they see on social media what happens in the rest of the world. They're well aware. They're much better digitally skilled than my generation, for instance. And they know about all the personalities. They know about all the celebrities. They know about all the trends that goes outside Iran. So that's a second part of this message. And then, of course, the third part is the word azadi, meaning freedom or liberty, which is this long standing demand of the Iranians, I would say, for the whole century, ever since the constitutional revolution of 1906.
Mhm.
Iran has witnessed this problem of authorities that usually emerged at the end of a revolution to basically impose its own image on the population, on the youth, and create authoritarian regimes, of which, over the course of time, I would say that the Islamic Republic is the worst, in the sense that its intrusion is not only in the political sense, for instance, banning the freedom of speech, meddling with the elections, banning political parties, all kinds of that things, which are the political or civil freedoms, but its intrusion into the personal life of the individual, which is the worst kind, in a sense, as you would see that there is always an authority that basically dominates your life or monitors your life. So and they do it in a kind of a very consistent fashion, which makes this idea of freedom so important as part of the message of this new movement. You would see that in today's Iran, there are no independent political parties. There is very little, probably, freedom of the press. I wouldn't say that it's entirely gone, but it's fairly limited. There's enormous amount of propaganda machine which dominates the entire radio and TV system in Iran. It's completely in the hands of the government. And of course, you would see this variety of other tools for trying to indoctrinate Iranian population across the board. So that's another sign of this kind of a sense of being totally left out. You're not belonging to what's going on in terms of power, empowerment, and disempowerment. So that's the situation as far as the idea of a freedom is concerned. And the three, somewhat miraculously and perhaps unintentionally, the three parts of this message complement each other, because perhaps for the first time we see that women are in the forefront of a movement. I hesitate to say revolution because I'm not particularly happy with revolutions. Revolutions worldwide and in Iran have always been so miserable in terms of their outcome that we have to be careful not to use the word
Yes.
the revolution again. So that's where it stands now.